This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Nam.
And this is Jamal Dejani.
Well, Jamal, we're at a critical turning point and one of those historical moments for the United States and frankly for the world right now. And we're going to be speaking about the murder of George Floyd, its implications locally, nationally, and internationally. Actually, as we're speaking right now from our shelter-in-place location in Northern California, one of the memorials for George Floyd is taking place right now. So it's kind of auspicious that we're doing Arab Talk right at the same time when one of the more poignant memorials is going on for this individual. We've been talking about this now. This is the third week now we've been speaking about this, Jamal, and the protests keep growing. The outrage keeps growing. We have all four officers now, as of yesterday, being charged with murder. The officer that had his knee on George Floyd and essentially personally murdered him is being charged with second-degree murder.
Just to add, that's Derek Chauvin.
Right, and the three accomplices, the ones who just stood around and watching this, have been charged with third-degree murder. And one of the important points is that Attorney General Ellison, the Attorney General for the state of Minnesota, is the one who personally gave a very poignant and very moving kind of explanation about why he, as the state Attorney General, got involved with this, upped the charges on Officer Chauvin, and basically, Jamal, this is capturing the nation together with the pandemic, but this is really one of those historical moments that for some people only shows up once in a generation.
That's right, Jess. As we're speaking now, we're watching the memorial going on now in Minneapolis. And yesterday we watched another memorial when the family came with the attorney speaking right at the site where George Floyd was murdered. I should say Derek Chauvin, he's the officer who had his knee on his neck and was charged with the second degree, or his charge was upgraded. Initially, it was a third-degree murder. Now it's second-degree murder. Then you have Alexander Kung and Thomas Lane. They both helped in restraining George Floyd. And then Tu Tao, he's the officer that stood in guard, right, basically preventing passersby and eyewitnesses from intervening, right, and sometimes reaching to his mace gun, in a threatening order, and the three of them were charged. I want us, because in this context, Jess, I saw a very important interview by the attorney of the George Floyd family. His name is Ben Crump, and he, right, towards the end of his interview, he summed it up all. Just started naming all the names of those being basically killed by police, throughout the years. And of course, the first name came to mind is Ahmaud Arbery. And there was an update because we spoke, right, about Ahmaud Arbery and in our show, Justice for Ahmaud, basically. Right. And we didn't think that just a couple of weeks later, we will be talking about another police brutality and a murder of an African-American man. But there is an update today before we watch the video by attorney Ben Crump, is that one of the third party in that chase, the one who took the video, his name is William Bryan.
Yeah,
he's now basically testifying against the father and son, the McMichaels, and he said, this is a new development, that actually there was a long chase, wow, of Ahmaud, that at times they hit him with the truck. He was hit, and they hit him, tried to run him over with the truck, and when the McMichael, the son, I think his name is Travis.
Yeah.
Travis McMichael shot Ahmaud 3 times. He used racial epithet.
Right.
I can't repeat it, but he used the N word, FN word,
Yeah.
while shooting him.
So how is that not premeditated murder, Jamal?
Well, it's definitely premeditated. Now you have one of the people who got charged now is testifying basically against the McMichaels. It's he was chased in the truck,
Right.
and the reason they caught up with him, he was hit and he was exhausted.
Right.
And he was exhausted, trying to cling to his life to defend himself the last moments before they shot him, or one of them shot him 3 times in the chest,
right,
and basically using racial epithet.
So the extremely disturbing development, Jamal, and the defense of the perpetrators of this is that the reason they shot him was in self-defense.
Nonsense.
It's nonsense.
It's lynching. It's a broad daylight lynching.
It's as we say in the legal world, it's premeditated murder. There was intention to kill and cause great bodily harm to Ahmaud Arbery, and they intended to kill him. And there's even more evidence for that right now. I think, you said that when Ben Crumb, the lawyer for George Floyd, mentioned a bunch of names, there was another name that came to my mind that we talked about this case too, from New York, Eric Garner,
absolutely,
which was about 5 years ago, Jamal, and that was, I unfortunately looked at that video recently, and the same kind of, absolute disgust, horror, pain of seeing an African-American man be murdered in broad daylight, saying those fateful, painful words that no human being should have to say, which is, I can't breathe. So the word lynching is very appropriate here, Jamal, when we're talking about African-American men who are succumbing to state violence, because this is violence by the state. The police represent the state. They are being lynched, and the reason lynching is a good word is because when you're lynched, you suffocate to death. And both for Eric Gardner and for George Floyd, these are African American, these are black men who were killed by suffocation.
Let's take a pause here, Jess. I want us to listen to Mr. Ben Crumb.
Tomorrow at North Central University with all his family, I also want us to remember that Breonna Taylor, the young lady who was executed in the sanctity of her own home in Louisville, Kentucky, birthday will be on Friday. So let's take a breath for Breonna as well. Let's take a breath for Ahmaud Arbery as well. Let's take a breath for Terrence Crutcher as well. Let's take a breath for Pamela Turner, who was killed in Houston. Let's take a breath for Alton Sterling, who was killed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Let's take a breath for Philando Castile, who was killed here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Let's take a breath for Laquan McDonald, who was killed in Chicago, Illinois. Let's take a breath for Sandra Bland, who was killed in Texas. Let's take a breath for Natasha McKinney, who was killed by police in Virginia.
That's right.
Let's take a breath for Stephon Clark, who was killed in Sacramento, California. Let's take a breath for Corey Jones, who was killed in Palm Beach, Florida. Let's take a breath for Botham Jones, who was killed in his own apartment in Dallas, Texas. Let's take a breath for Eric Gardner, who was killed in Staten Island, New York. Let's take a breath for Freddie Gray, who was killed in Baltimore, Maryland. Let's take a breath for Walter Scott, who was killed in South Carolina. Let's take a breath for Jamar Clark, who was killed here in Minneapolis.
Right.
Let's take a breath for Let's take a breath for Michael Brown, who was killed in Ferguson. Let's take a breath for 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was killed in Cleveland, Ohio by the police. Let's take a breath for Trayvon Benjamin Martin, who was killed in Sanford, Florida. Let's take a breath for Emmett Till, who was killed in Mississippi. Let's take a breath collectively for all of the marginalized and disenfranchised and dehumanized people, whether black, brown, white, or red, who were killed unjustifiably, who were killed unnecessarily, and who was killed senselessly because they are American citizens, one, they are human beings, two, and finally, we should all remember they are children of God.
Well, that's Ben Crumb, the attorney for the family of George Floyd. Very poignant, Jamal, with the names. And, this is, this case against these four officers, for the murder of George Floyd represents a much larger kind of picture of what's happening to African American men, not just this year, but for hundreds of years, Jamal.
Well, exactly, Jess. And this is the point. When people question why people are marching in the streets, or they use the term, why are they rioting in the streets? Why are they angry? It's not an isolated incident. This is not an isolated incident with the police. It's a systematic racial profiling, police brutality, targeting African American men and women, mostly men in this case, even though women, there was also the case of the woman who got shot in her own bedroom,
right?
Because of they went to the wrong, basically, apartment,
right?
And then we can think about the first images that started to come on TV with the brutal beating of Rodney King, and yesterday I watched his daughter also speaking about his case. And this is when, and then later on, because we don't know about all these cases that have not been captured on camera.
Right.
Going before Rodney King and even after Rodney King, it's not always when you have people around. It's not always when you have eyewitnesses. It's not always when you have somebody with an iPhone, or a smartphone. And so this is the tipping point.
I hope you're right. I don't know if it's a tipping point. I hope you're right, Jamal.
I'm hoping it is the tipping point, because
I
people
don't know.
are saying enough is enough. And the other thing is this is not about just America. This is a global story that people across the universe. I've been watching TV. I've been watching TV in the Middle East, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya. I've been watching other news networks in France. Of course, there were demonstrations in France and wherever. And this story has captured the attention of the entire globe. And also, and I'm sad to say that, highlighted the hypocrisy of the United States.
Yet again,
when we lecture the world. I mean, just recently we were lecturing China about its brutal reaction in Hong Kong. And then people across the globe watch what's happening in the United States, watching the thousands and tens of thousands of people from city to city, basically going out in the streets. So in that sense, I believe the United States has lost its credibility to lecture the world on human rights, when we cannot have our own human rights right here in this country protected. When I see these hypocrites on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, lecturing China, lecturing other countries, Iran and Egypt and so forth, about
human rights.
human rights. Let's treat the demonstrators with humanity. We just can't do that anymore. We have to clean our own house. We have to put our house in order, and this needs a systematic reform. It's not about one case. It's not about
Jamal.
one case. It's just so embedded in our schools, in our police departments, in the government, everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Jamal, and that's why we call it structural racism. It's not a singular event directed toward a singular person, although George Floyd's case represents, because of the brutality and the nature of it, is kind of a representation of the totality of what we're talking about. But structurally, the racism involved in the criminal justice system is really the thing that we're talking about. In terms of we have no right to lecture other countries, that started decades ago, Jamal. I have to say that, this idea that the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy, and we're at the United Nations lecturing other people about human rights, yet when this country has been involved in a clandestine torture program, when this country has continued to support Israeli brutal tactics, which we're going to talk to a little bit later when we find out about the Minnesota Police Department being trained by the Israeli, the Israeli military and the Israeli police. The credibility of this country, Jamal, to lecture other people about human rights was lost many decades ago. This is yet another painful reminder to the world that the United States is really got an endemic problem. The knee of the state has been on the necks of African Americans, of black men, for many, many decades, if not hundreds of years since slavery, Jamal. And we are, the good news, if there is good news in all of this, is that some white people, some politicians, some people in authority are finally, when they see this, right in their face, are beginning to take notice. But let's not.
I hope it sinks in. I don't know. Not a temporary thing that
but I don't know.
All be. They're just going to all react now, and we're going to all, mourn the death of and the murder of George Floyd, and then a month down the line, we're going to see something similar to this.
Well,
but
I don't know.
On the topic of Israel and and Palestine, Palestinians are no strangers to seeing images like George Floyd. In fact, Palestinians have hundreds of George Floyd, starting from children to women, to journalists, to adults, to the elderly who have been brutalized by Israeli occupation soldiers. We have images to show how Israeli soldiers similarly they step on the neck, or they put a knee on the neck of Palestinian kids and many others. In fact, Amnesty International, Jess, had a whole report talking about what you've mentioned, having U.S. law enforcement agencies training in Israel. This include, by the way, law enforcement officials from Baltimore. That's documented. We're not coming up with it. From Baltimore, Florida, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, California, where we live, Arizona, Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Georgia, Washington State, as well as D.C. Washington, D.C., the capital, basically police all travel to Israel for training, while thousands of others receive training from Israeli officials in the U.S. Just many of these trips are taxpayer funded, while others are privately funded.
Right.
And this is since 2002, the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, the American Jewish Committee's Project Interchange, and the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs have paid for police chiefs, assistant chiefs, and captains to train in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories. So they were not only in Israel, but they were also training in the in the West Bank. And so there are many groups that have been criticizing them. Amnesty International, and according to the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in 2018, basically we've seen a major increase, 70% increase over the previous year in Israeli settler violence toward Palestinians, and a rise in Palestinian death. Actually, before we continue talking about this, we have a video that was produced by Jewish Voice for Peace talking about this. So let's watch and listen to it.
In the last 15 years, thousands of U.S. police, border agents, ICE officers, and FBI officials have traveled to Israel.
We bring over to Israel American police chiefs, sheriffs, law enforcement of every type.
Israeli military personnel also travel to the U.S. to exchange tactics with police departments and state agencies. So what's wrong with these exchanges? Under the banner of counterterrorism training, officials visit Israeli checkpoints, settlements, prisons, Secret Service, and airports. In each of these sites, human rights groups have documented Israeli discrimination, repression, torture, and killing of Palestinians. And the far-right administrations of Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump are magnifying these human rights abuses, whether that means escalating settlement construction in Israel or ramping up deportations and Islamophobic travel bans in the U.S.
You know, in Israel, they profile. They've done an unbelievable job, as good as you can do.
The police exchanges are one place among many where these two repressive governments deepen their relationship. What is really being exchanged? Arms. These exchange trips occur in the context of larger U.S.-Israeli security collaboration, which includes a constant flow of weaponry. Israel is known as the world's shopping mall for homeland security technologies. The U.S. supplies them with $3.8 billion each year and with weapons, such as tear gas used against peaceful protesters in both countries. These exchanges build relationships between officials who work for both the government and in private arms and security industries. Tactics. A major focus of the exchange trips is how to expand existing surveillance practices in both countries, with little regard for human or civil rights. Israel has more surveillance companies per capita than any other country in the world, and uses non-stop surveillance in its military occupation of Palestinians. Spying is also key to policing in the U.S., which has the biggest sheer number of surveillance companies in the world. Hewlett-Packard, for example, developed the high-tech identification cards that Israeli security forces use at occupied West Bank checkpoints to collect facial, fingerprint, and retinal data. Ideology. The exchange trips advance racist policies and target social justice movements as security threats. Delegates meet with Israeli riot police, who are well documented in their use of violence when suppressing peaceful Palestinian protest. So who's going on these exchanges? Officials on these exchanges from the U.S. include officers from the NYPD that profile Muslim and Arab communities, surveilling every mosque within 100 miles of New York City and beyond. Officers who are building the largest deportation machine in U.S. history. Officers who lead police departments that brutalize black and brown communities. The former St. Louis police chief Timothy Fitch trained with the Israeli military 3 years before Michael Brown's killing and the Ferguson uprising. Officers who attack indigenous-led social movements, like the Water Protectors at Standing Rock. These exchanges build relationships between these U.S. forces and Israeli officials carrying out similarly repressive, violent, and racist policies against Palestinians, Mizrahi and Ethiopian Jews, and political activists. Simply put, these trips serve as an exchange of worst practices, emboldening racist policing in the U.S. and holding up an occupying army as a global gold standard.
Well, Jamal, that was very compelling from the Jewish Voice for Peace video on this. You know, it speaks to this larger issue, which is finally being discussed, which is the militarization of local police forces. And the whole, since 2002, I think, or 2003, after 9/11, there was this push to militarize local police. And what that was is really the influence from being trained by the Israeli police, who were also militarily trained. And now we have a confluence and this is why the Jewish Voice for Peace mini-doc is so important, because basically these Israeli tactics, these Israeli military tactics, have found their ways into local police departments all over the United States. What I want to just remind you, Jamal, the one word that has come up, the one tactic, the one technique that has come up for the first time, not the first time, but more pronounced than before. You and I will recognize this. What are police using now, Jamal? Rubber bullets. When was the last time you heard the use of rubber bullets being used against U.S. citizens for peacefully demonstrating?
By the way, they're targeting also journalists with these rubber bullets, not only the demonstrators.
A couple of journalists have been shot with rubber bullets. Well, guess where rubber bullets got its infamous name from the Israeli military and police using rubber bullets on Palestinian men, women, and children. And that word, rubber bullets, is intended to convey, to soften the term of using regular ammunition or a regular bullet. But you and I know very well, Jamal, since we covered this on Arab Talk for many years, rubber bullets are just as lethal, just as dangerous, can kill, maim, and hurt people, just like any other ammunition shot from a rifle or a gun. So we now have a world, Jamal, where the militarization, based on the training from the Israeli police and military, has pervaded local policing here in the United States. You have Humvees, you have helicopters. I call it the Israelization of local policing.
Canisters of gas, tear gas.
Exactly. And so,
I mean, some of the scenes actually looked like the West
Gaza.
Bank.
Looked like Gaza in the West
all
Bank.
the gas, and then the attire, by the way, it's no longer police. I mean, you are talking about basically militarizing the police, the way they look, the way they're dressed, what they're carrying, the tactics they use, the equipment they use. It's no longer, looks like an occupation, really.
Well, Jamal, this gets us to the next point, which is Donald Trump, together with his Attorney General William Barr, and supported by this Senator Tom Cotton, who actually wrote a opinion piece for the New York Times, had the audacity to print this, and the title of Senator Cotton's opinion piece in the New York Times was "Bring in the Military." And so when in the United States have we seen the military being used against its own citizens? It's the Insurrection Act, which is a very old act from the beginning of this country. The last time it was used was 1992 when Rodney King was murdered. The time before that was 1958, Jamal, when Dwight Eisenhower was using it to quell some unrest that was going on in the late 1950s. So we're talking about Donald Trump not just militarizing the police, but using rhetoric to attack American citizens for their First Amendment right, and speaking in this, what I would call thuggish way, saying that we need to militarize and basically put pressure, military pressure, to clean up the violence that's taking place. And of course, as happens, Jamal, when an incompetent thug preaches like that in a role of leadership, what's going to happen? Of course, it's going to backfire. And what we're seeing is that the protests have only increased. We're going on 11 straight days now of primarily peaceful protests. And, we can only hope that this is a kind of turning point, because the rhetoric coming from the Trump administration is more thuggish. It's more militaristic. And I don't know about you, but it's becoming more more. It's an understatement to say concerning, because when we think about who uses the military to threaten its citizens, only dictators and despots do that. And we're talking about Putin. We're talking about Kim Jong-un. We're talking about the former Arab leaders like Saddam Hussein, or even current Arab leaders like Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. These are really big, thuggish people who are despots and dictators who turn their own military against their own people. And
we should, just to be fair also, I mean, you're absolutely 100% right about Trump, but also we should say also that Trump's own defense secretary, Mark Esper, said on Wednesday that he opposes using military forces for law enforcement.
But he walked it back later in the day.
Yeah, but he said it. And then, as
he walked it back.
And then, as you know, yesterday, General Mattis, right? He made a shocking statement. And I always say, why now? What took you so long?
Right.
Exactly. I always say that, but then I remember, well, better late than never, that these people are speaking against these actions. So I think there is a split in the action of what Donald Trump wants to do, and with his generals, and this is actually very important to point this out. And I don't think if you talk to the military establishment, they see their role as patrolling the streets of the United States, or they accept what's happening.
Absolutely, Jamal, you're absolutely right. The military historically, and the military leadership historically, despite all of their problems and whatever issues, that they've had that we've talked about, for years here, the one thing that most military leaders by far agree upon, you don't turn your military force on its citizens. And I think you're right. General Mattis's op-ed was very powerful. Admiral Mullins made a similar statement the day before, which was very, very powerful. Mark Esper had a little bit of cojones yesterday, but then later on the day, when he heard that President Trump was displeased by his comment, in fact, was able...
Displeased means that he was going to fire him.
Yeah.
I mean, how Trump reacts to
right, he walked it back. But I think the larger image here and picture that we hope our viewers and listeners are beginning to, I'm sure, see and understand is that you have a president of the United States who feels very weak right now, because for a president to use this rhetoric and to call out the military through his attorney general, and that crazy photo op at the church, which we should talk about in a minute, reflects his own wish to be a dictator and a thug, but also reflects his deep insecurity, his deep weakness, and of course, he's falling in the polls against Joe Biden. So this, Jamal, we're worried that this will only get worse as Joe Biden, his polling gets better, and the thuggish narratives that are coming out from the White House will probably increase. So I think things are probably going to get worse.
They are going to get worse, and I have this nightmare vision that Trump won't leave office if he loses, and especially if we have a close vote. That then we'll start thinking about the National Guard and the military and who's going to support him. I have this nightmarish vision, and which. I don't think it's ever happened in the United States. But,
it hasn't.
But the way he acts, the way he reacts, instead of de-escalating, he just takes these crazy positions. And then you've mentioned the photo op that he went brandishing a Bible in front of the church, where he was not invited, where basically the whole parish didn't know about that he was going there. And of course, they didn't show you in that photo op how the police and the Secret Service were brutalizing the demonstrators to basically make way for him to go there. Later on, we saw these images that he was not really welcome to be there.
No.
And then you look at that image. I mean, this is an image that's supposed to unite the country. It's supposed to display unity, diversity. Who did we see? 5 or 6 white men
people.
and 1 white woman.
Right.
And this is America's Trump, or this is what his vision. I mean, and the white woman happens to be his spokeswoman, his
Press
charge
secretary.
of communicate,
Yeah.
press secretary or whatever. I mean, if he had, I don't know, he used to have Hopes as his communication director. I don't think she's there. But the optics, I mean, this is the White House, for God's sake. The optics of this, you're trying to send a message to the world, not only to the United States, because people are demonstrating about racial profiling, about beating up and killing. I just want to say something which I kind of made me change my mind hearing it and watching it. George Floyd wasn't killed. George Floyd was tortured to death. That's a whole different story. Killing is one thing. If a police officer picks up a gun and shoots something, then they can claim they did it in a moment of anger or a moment of distress or a moment of confusion. He was tortured for almost 9 minutes and died from his torture. This is how he died.
I think that's a very, very important thing that you're saying, Jamal. I want to just refer to the autopsy yesterday, which supports what you're saying, but in a more disturbing way. One of the doctors that was speaking the other day that did the autopsy on George Floyd said that he suspects that George Floyd died 3 minutes and 50 seconds into the act of Officer Chavren's knee being on his neck. And we know that he had his knee on George Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes, as you said.
And another officer, I think, had the knee on his back, too.
So basically, he died after 3.5, 4 minutes, and yet they continued to torture, which I think is an appropriate word, this man in a way that is incomprehensible. He had already died after about 3.5, 4 minutes, yet for another 4.5 minutes, they continued to basically crush his vertebrae, his cervical neck area, crush his windpipe, and inflict this brutality on a man who had already passed away. So I think torture is a very appropriate word to use in this case, and that's why I keep coming back to this thing, Jamal. This is state-sponsored violence against black people.
You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM, and we also welcome our viewers on YouTube and on Facebook. Yes, Jess, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is such an inhumane, thing to watch. It's something that, again, like thinking about what Ben Crump, the attorney, when he was reciting all these names for the world to hear and listen, that this is, the whole thing about I can't breathe, an entire nation can't breathe because of these actions. It's systematic. Racism is basically systematic, and it's the entire globe has been watching it. Jess. And so now we're coming, this is happening. I want to think about the whole stress that a lot of people have been going through in this country, their frustration. For the past couple of months or so, we've been talking about the COVID-19, the global pandemic. But also the global pandemic itself has been selective in a way it affected people. And the African American community is devastated more than others by this pandemic.
Well, that's exactly right, Jamal. And so when we talk about systemic and systematic racism, targeting black men and women in such a way that they are killed and murdered and arrested at a much greater rate than white people, it translates in the same way to health disparities and the fact that maybe only 7 or 8% of the people who get infected with COVID-19 are African American. 50, 60, 70% of the people who die from COVID-19 are black men and women, primarily black men. So the racism doesn't just start and stop at the door of the justice system, which is grotesquely racist. It's the same thing in our health system, because the murder and the death of African American men and women is also coming at the hands of our health system, which has tremendous health disparities affecting the African American community. This is really devastating. I will say it's a devastating time for the African American community, but that's from a white perspective, Jamal, because from the African American perspective, they, as I said before, they've had the state and the police state knee on their necks for hundreds of years, and they've had the short end of the stick in the healthcare system for decades and decades. So this is not news. What's news is that finally the rest of the society is finally waking up to see it. And just to kind of talk about COVID-19 and the pandemic, Jamal, it's not as if the virus takes a break because we're trying to mourn the death of George Floyd. As of today, 6.5 million total cases in the world, almost 390,000 global deaths in the United States, 1.8 million people infected. But here's the stark figure, Jamal. We're closing in on 110,000 deaths in the United States. Over 40 million people in the United States have lost their jobs. This is, again, we said this earlier in the show, one of these historical moments for this country that is just getting worse. And we have to put that in the context of absolutely no leadership from the pandemic perspective coming from Washington, no leadership coming from the social justice point of view from Washington, D.C. Thankfully, we heard from, even though it's a little late, we heard from Barack Obama, we heard from George Bush, we heard from Jimmy Carter, we heard from Bill Clinton, all kind of trying to pick up the pieces of some kind of leadership right now when there's just, people call it a vacuum, Jamal. I don't think it's a vacuum of leadership.
Well, if it was a vacuum only, that's one thing. But we have someone who is destructive.
Exactly.
I mean, a vacuum, you have an absence of leadership. But this leadership takes actions
Exactly.
that are harmful to this country, whether the pandemic or on race relations or on the economy and because unemployment. Now, here is one thing. I've been watching, of course, Fox News. I try to always watch all these diverse networks, including Fox, and it's very painful to watch them. But their focus has been on the riots and the destruction. So their focus, of course, I'm saddened to see some people and businesses losing property, and also there was a police captain who was killed.
Right.
And others, but that's their focus. The focus is it's not like understanding why are these people rioting. There are some maybe few bad apples who just use this opportunity to steal, but others. I mean, I've seen people who actually were going in to grab bottles of water and toilet paper.
Right.
Because people don't think that people who are not only angry about the death of George Floyd and before that Ahmaud Arbery, but you're talking about people who are in the front lines, who are the blue-collar workers
Right,
who
the
lost
essential
their
workers,
jobs.
right.
The essential workers, they have no money to eat. They don't have money to get out. So for them, this whole idea about, let's save our property or let's watch our investment account at Charles Schwab and Fidelity, whatever, it's going up and down. They have zero money there to watch. It doesn't make any difference to them whether the and by the way, the stock market is for the rich people. It has not been that bad because it has recovered pretty much most of its losses. But these guys have been out of a job for 3 months.
That's right, Jamal. I'm really glad you brought up that issue, because part of what you're hearing from the conservative media, Fox et al., is that they say really terrible things like they're focusing on the violence. This is violence this and violence that. The most nuanced thing you hear them say is, well, the violence takes away from the message, right? Of George.
I thought about this initially myself last show. I said it should be peaceful,
and I gave you a hard time. I know I gave you a hard time,
and I still support the peaceful, but I also understand people's frustration. Minus the few who are opportunists, really.
Okay.
But the other people, and then I've also watched video just when demonstrations start very peacefully, and then the police comes into the picture and they start pushing people away, and they start lobbing tear gas at them, and then it turns violent.
Right, and then you also have this report that came out from various...
and then the other video I watched are white instigators.
Well, I was just going to say that.
Also causing, in fact, there is a video that went viral of an African-American woman going after two white women who were tagging a Starbucks and said, don't do it in our neighborhood because... And they're basically also tagging it with BLM, Black Lives Matter. So they'll think that it's the Black Lives Matter people. And then she was shooing them away, saying, just don't do it in our neighborhood.
But that's a really good point, Jamal, because the FBI has come out and said that a lot of white supremacy groups are masquerading as, quote, Antifa, or masquerading as, being supportive of the protest. But actually what they're doing is provoking people towards violence. And in fact, they arrested somebody in Minnesota who was a white guy, white supremacist, who was bringing bombs to hand out to people to throw. So you have part of the white supremacy movement who are trying to use this opportunity to kind of confront institutional racism and have justice reform, social justice reform, using it as an opportunity to foment more divisions. I just want to say one more thing really quick about this. I'm glad that you rethought your comment, because one of the things I'm hearing a lot from people is, it takes away from the message when there's violence. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with the violence. I'm not. But what I am saying is that the violence is part of the message. It doesn't take away from the message. It's actually part of the message, because violence is being perpetrated against Black Americans. Full stop. Yet, when violence is being directed towards, symbols of capitalism or symbols of white supremacy, then, oh no, we can't have that. So we really need to be very careful about the language. Of course, we don't condone that kind of violence, but to say that that's not part of the message, it kind of is part of the message, to be honest.
We have few minutes left, Jess. I want to talk quickly about some of the legal kind of predictions. I've been watching a lot of good attorneys, and basically what they've been saying, and this is also another of my worries and fears, that they're saying, okay, well, finally these officers got arrested and they've been charged, but that's one thing. Conviction is a whole different thing, because we've seen time and time again cases, and I didn't know that, to tell you the truth, myself, until I started digging further into that, and that there are so many loopholes that the police departments have across the United States that makes it very difficult to convict police officers
for
murder. And so my fear is that now people feel a little bit vindicated, and the families are saying, because that's basically the basis of their anger. Had not the district attorney in Minnesota took their time to basically arrest them. I mean, the initial report, they just fired them. And now, and then this will drag on for a few months or maybe more,
longer,
years,
longer.
and these guys either get acquitted or they get a slap on the wrist, and the second degree murder charge becomes manslaughter or something like this. Because and I've heard that from several attorneys, that a lot of people are going to have interest in this case, and they're going to have top-notch attorneys paid by white supremacist groups and others and whoever, and who are going to find all these loopholes in these different laws to basically reduce their sentence.
I think, Jamal, I think that's something to be very concerned about. If you look at the conviction rate for officers who commit these violent acts, who charged with murder or manslaughter, the conviction rate is less than 5%. It's really, it's very, very low.
Well, I mean, this is what happened with Rodney King.
Exactly.
Rodney King, we've witnessed not one officer, not two, not three, I don't know how many there were there, like almost a dozen of them, beating the living daylight out of him. And then they basically were set. They were exonerated.
Well,
and that's what kind of drove the people into the streets. And I have to remind people that Rodney King's demonstrations, or so-called riots at the time, lasted for almost 2 months.
Right. And unfortunately,
6 weeks.
Right. And but look at what happened after Rodney King was murdered. Rodney King was beaten. He wasn't murdered, but, when he was beaten. Let's look at what happened. Was there any police reform? No, very little. A lot of these problems were endemic also under the Obama administration. I don't want to let the Obama administration off the hook, but what I will give the Obama administration some credit for is that they did have a policy or did have a program for police reform in terms of using these tactics against civilians. And one of the first things that Trump did when he was elected is undo all of those safeguards that the Obama administration had put in. So one of the things Obama said the other day, I think, yesterday, in fact, was that they have a proposal for police reform. It's not going to come from the federal government. It has to be done local. And hopefully, worst case scenario, Jamal, nothing happens. These police officers, are released, they're not convicted, and we're back to square one. Maybe this will lead to some sort of reform at the local level for police, using these violent tactics of, I'm just going to call them what they are, Jamal. These are Israeli tactics.
Well, I'm listening to you, you're talking about police reform, and instead of having police reform, we're basically outsourcing brutality. We are sending our police officers. We're not sending them to Switzerland. We're sending them to a country that engages in torture, human rights abuses, murder, apartheid, beating, all on camera. It's all captured. We're not making this up. I mean, they're not, like I said, sent to Sweden or Switzerland or some, they've been sent to the most brutal country now on earth to dealing with basically an indigenous population.
Right.
And then we're bringing them back here to the United States. And who do they practice it on? They practice it not on white people initially, because we know how white people are treated differently. They target African Americans, Latinos, Latinas, people of color. And so that's why I can't think about the reform. End these basically exchanges. And the other maddening thing is I don't see the media talking about that enough. They try to kind of, the Amnesty International is calling attention to it, other human rights organizations calling attention to it, and then the media doesn't mention where do these police officers receive their training.
Well, on that note, we'll be covering it here on Arab Talk. You've been listening to Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal on KPOO 89.5 FM here in San Francisco. We continue to bring you our Arab Talk shows from our shelter-in-place location in Northern California. We're going to continue to do this. We encourage you to go to our websites where you can find all of our shows, ArabTalkRadio.com. But go to Jamal's Facebook page. A lot of great information. You can see the show live. That's Jamal Dajani, too. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.